Good evening and welcome to the Missoula Theater of Operations. Tonight's show is the second in a series brought to you by the Missoula Peace Network. I'm your host, Meg Knox, and with me tonight is Bill Chaloupka, a professor of political science from the University of Montana, Tracy Stone-Manning, a freelance environmental public relations consultant from Missoula, and Dan Baum, a freelance writer from Missoula. We're going to start out tonight talking about how television influenced our understanding of the war. And since Bill watches more TV than any of the rest of us here, we'll start with Bill.
Yeah, I listen to television. I think that's the way to do it. You can wash dishes at the same time, and it was worth about that much in its war coverage. I think this was an extraordinary television event. Everyone I know is talking about the television. Everybody was glued to the screen. And I hear a lot of different opinions.
I'm so bummed out now to learn that people got killed in the war. You know, it was such a great TV event. You know, and now they're coming out with casualty figures and these pictures of the strafed Iraqis, and I'm so bummed out. Did you know people got killed in this war?
Well, I don't have a TV, so I didn't watch TV except for the night that the war broke out. Yeah, and I want to know why people were glued to their television sets. Well, I mean, I saw the nifty graphics, and I was pulled into that football scene, but why were they?
The first night wasn't about the nifty graphics. The first night was about having people on the ground in a country we were attacking. Yeah. That was a very exciting prospect. Somewhere beyond the first night, the excitement and the potential of that moment was lost.
But Scud Night was great. Scud Night was night two, when the first Scuds were hitting Israel, and that was the beginning of gas mask video. That was, to me, you know, better than the first night because you know, the word went around. You know, like the word had gone around the night before. You know, the war had started. And then the second night, something is exploding in Tel Aviv, and we all went. And sure enough, there were people in gas masks and talking to. Here's a trivia question: Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli, the Paul Newman lookalike Israeli we saw all those nights. He was in a gas mask, and that was great. That's some
true.
Of the best.
But by it seems to me, at least by the third night, they had the graphics in place. War in the Gulf. They'd gotten rid of the Malox commercials, and this was.
It's because the Malox people pulled out.
Yeah.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Everybody
pulled out early.
They don't want to be associated with war. That's right.
Everybody but those fakakta Swiss cough drops. They hung on all through the war. But
must have been good for cough drop sales.
Everybody else pulled out.
The television's main job is to attract your gaze and to hold it there. And that's what television does. And so it does it by imparting a sense of drama to events. It does it by imparting a sense of immediacy, of intensity, and war is television's best show, and that's.
But the first night they had no video. We looked at talking heads of retired generals.
But as Meg says, the whole idea was that you could sit in your living room and say, he's being bombed right now by our planes, and it was live.
It wasn't the talking heads of retired generals that was exciting. Yeah. It was the voices out of Baghdad. It was still photographs.
Think about Edward R. Murrow. Remember how much of a stir Edward R. Murrow made. You know, Edward R. Murrow was in London. He was in an Allied city. And here's Peter Arnett and Bernie Shaw, you know, in Baghdad. Part of the drama was that Bernie Shaw was losing it right in front of a radio. You know, excuse me, folks, while I crawl under this table, and it was incredible. And there was a little irony, a little irony here because Bernie Shaw, you know, let's remember Bernie Shaw more than any other individual gave us George Bush, and Bernie Shaw was the guy who asked the question of Dukakis in the second debate. What would you do if Kitty? If your wife was raped, you know, and in an attempt, in some sort of journalistic attempt to test if Dukakis had emotions, you know. Dukakis, instead of crawling over the table and slugging Bernie in the mouth, Dukakis answered the question, bad move, and George Bush gets to be president, and here's George Bush's bombs trying to kill Bernie Shaw in Baghdad on the air. And that's,
in fact, proving that you have emotions is a lot of what this war was about. I mean, it was George Bush proving that he could really care about something.
That he's not a wimp.
That he's not a wimp.
I like him better when he was a
wimp. It was theater for George Bush.
Oh, and as Bill says, you spoke over each other. Tracy said you could have been listening to the radio that night, and of course. That's the whole idea, but we weren't listening to the radio.
But
we were watching the box, and we were watching for hours.
I watched a box of a map.
Yes, but part of the excitement...
But it said underneath Baghdad Audio.
Yes, Baghdad Audio.
Baghdad Audio,
Right.
Which is a discount car stereo place on Frelinghuysen Avenue in Irvington.
Plus you could switch channels and watch Tom Brokaw just be angry and embarrassed that they didn't have the story. You know?
Right.
That's what made CNN so good. It's not that they're great television journalists, but they obviously are great talkers to authority because CNN was able to talk. That's what made that TV so great. They were able to talk the Iraqi handlers into letting them stay upstairs. Everybody else got rounded up and put in the basement.
Well, and we're having fun with this stuff, but I think Meg's point's an important point. The possibility of war has changed now that it's clear that there will be live television coverage from the home base of the adversary. I mean, there's been a lot of hooray, a lot of yellow ribbons, a lot of loud patriotism. Bottom line, the big new weapon of this war is not the Patriot anti-missile. The big new weapon of this war is Peter Arnett and the satellite.
Whose weapon is that? Now, Peter Arnett, I must admit, during the latter days of the war, my television viewing fell way down. I don't know how the Nielsen ratings went, if they followed that, but I got so tired of wading through the lame analysis and repetition between live events that I tuned out a lot. But during that time, Peter Arnett was on the ground, and people in the United States were calling him a traitor for doing any kind of reporting about what our bombs were doing to Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you can call this a great new weapon. It didn't win the war.
I don't think it was a weapon at all because
it didn't have any effect.
They didn't use it to their fullest capacity because I don't know if it's because they chose not to or weren't allowed to. But I didn't see video that horrified me.
Of course, you didn't watch television.
What are you doing on this panel?
We'll move on to another question.
Nobody called me up and said, come to my house to watch my TV. I mean, as far as I know, we never really got on the front lines.
You had to be dedicated to stick with it.
So I go to the laundromat and I'm washing my clothes and I watch CNN while I'm doing this. And it seems to me I'm almost looking at stock footage of tanks driving through a desert, of troops playing football in a desert. And I thought, this is not war. We think we're in there and we think it's a living room war, but we're removed from it. I'm not watching Iraqi people dead, being blown up.
Of course, of course.
Maybe then it was a little of that.
I think it is true. CNN was pretty careful. CNN was intimidated, and the New York Times reported that the Republican National Committee put 500,000 letters out saying write CNN and complain about Peter Arnett being a traitor.
The Republican National Committee?
Yes, the New York Times story last week. So clearly CNN was intimidated, but I don't care how intimidated they were. That's the weapon, and we'll see it in the next war.
How's that weapon effective?
Weapon for who?
Their side or ours? No, well, weapons get used by whoever has it, whoever has the television sets. It won't work on Tracy because she doesn't have a television set, but it'll work on everybody else, and it limits what you can do.
Right, and I think one of the things that Bill is saying obliquely is that third world leaders have to learn how to use the media. I was sitting there, and if they want their interests put across, they've got to learn to show television reporters what is happening in their country, and to open up in that way. And they got better at that. They started bringing people around to hospitals and to bomb shelters, and that was the big. I think that was the big breakthrough.
There was no censorship reminders on that. They just said, obviously, it was obviously a pretty
that's what I wanted.
Dried thing.
That's what I wanted for 6 weeks of the war, and I wanted that because I wanted it to come home to Americans and to make it less of a glorifying thing.
So you think it was a weapon? I mean, you're talking about it being a weapon. It was used effectively. Who by? I mean, did it by the Pentagon?
And everybody's got guns, and everybody's got television sets, and everybody's got satellite dishes, and it works.
Not everybody's got cameras, though, and I think. That frankly, that it would, as Tracy was saying, have been in Saddam's interest to let more of those people down to his front.
Sure. Oh yeah.
To the extent that he started catching on to that, I think Americans were sickened by the war.
Well, I find it horrifying that Americans felt they were seeing and hearing too much.
Well, wait a minute.
I thought war is ugly. You should hear and see too much. And
well, yeah, but they said don't keep that man off here, keep that man off here. But what they watched? They watched that man, you know, and they were all glued to Peter Arnett's face, right? You know, take that away from me, take that away from me. You know, it's like a fat person eating. You know, he said with some expertise.
But it was so much fun to watch so much of the time. You didn't see it, obviously.
What, am I scum for this?
It's politically suspect.
You're just speaking for the other side, right, you know.
Right. One night, CBS, it was right after the ground war started, or right before the ground war started, CBS wanted to, you know, they lacked footage, obviously, so they brought out toys. They brought out little Mattel toys, and they made this really neat, I'm sure they set it up on the top of a ping pong table, the way I did with my soldier sets when I was 8.
Yeah. Oh, God.
And
it was great. They had sand, they had little explosions of light, you know, they had superimposed animations of light.
And this is why, if you talk to people who had relatives over in the Gulf, if they were rah-rah, support Bush, they were glued to their TVs. When I talked to people who were involved in the peace movement and who had relatives over in the Gulf, they couldn't stand watching TV. Right. Precisely what turned you off, Tracy, I think turned off a lot of people, you know, certainly a lot of people with relatives over there who really didn't like the display, the sort of infantile display of prurient interest in how our weapons were working, with the enormous lack of footage of what those weapons were doing.
It was a weird feeling to know that this terrible thing was going on, and obviously the technology was there to bring it. I mean, this terrible thing is going on. Another amazing thing is that we're all realizing, God, we can watch anything going on in the world live. But the technology was there. The technology was there, but somebody was standing in the way, whether it was the Iraqis or the Pentagon or whoever. It was an awful feeling to know this amazing thing was going on. The technology exists that could let us be watching it while it's going on, and yet we couldn't. We were watching Wolf Blitzer.
Part of it is modern warfare, isn't it? I mean, not much was happening up close. I mean, I think probably shots were being fired from 35 miles away.
Tell it to the people of Tikrit.
It's hard to.
That was happening up close.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's true. You mean, but being on the ground.
Nothing was happening.
But Arnett was there with the victims. You know,
right?
I mean, what is there to watch as a plane flies through the air at 500 miles an hour? What's to watch is the plane taking off and the bombs landing.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I think one of the things that happened here, we talked a lot. There was a lot of talk about censorship. I think it's now clear that the networks intended to take the Pentagon on the issue of censorship once the ground battle began. And CBS, ABC immediately fired across the desert in their own trucks out of the pool. You know, broke the pool completely.
Why wait till the ground war?
And well, because before that, what are you going to do? You're gonna fly an airplane next to the jet that's flying. You know, and there's nothing to do. But the ground over the ground. No, that's it may be wrong, but it's how they perceived it. And they said this is where we break the pool, but the ground war was over so fast.
But the networks went wrong when they bought into the toy aspect. I mean, I'm horrified that all of America knows the ins and outs and all the names of our war toys. That the fact that Topps is Topps, isn't it? That is putting out baseball cards on the different airplanes. I mean, so you can talk to a high school kid on the street and he can tell you how fast a certain plane is going to fly or how many bombs a B-52 can carry, but he can't tell you why we were in the war. He can't tell you anything about the historical background of what got us there.
But neither can the man who started the war. So don't be so hard on this 12-year-old kid on the street.
I'm not being hard on the 12-year-old kid.
Let's not blame the victim.
That's also a particular.
But I would hope that the media would have instead of buying into that, oh gosh, let's show nifty graphics of planes and how they can say, see that structural weakness in that building? Why, that's what we're going to blow away. I mean, I want to know why they want to blow that building away.
Of course. But But what Bill is saying is,
well, they told us a million times
it's
freedom, freedom, freedom. And the problem is not that they didn't tell us. The problem is that there was only one view on there. And again, television has always thought that it needed to be exciting and just simply to attract our gaze, and therefore television has always made both liberals and conservatives angry. But now finally they've discovered that they don't have to worry about making the conservatives angry.
Right.
They can ignore the liberals, the liberal voice totally absent. I mean, they were asking generals political questions.
Yeah.
Also, Tracy has a point. It hurts that we have that we don't pay attention to history in this country. I mean, as Todd Gitlin said the other night, the worst thing that you can say to another American is, "Your history." and television is a perfect medium for a nation that wants to forget about history. You get the visuals, you get the immediacy, and because you also don't know how to use the language, you don't, as an anchor or as a reporter, put out much in the way of words about what came before. And usually it's got to be words that are doing that, unless you're awfully fast with your file footage. BBC, despicable as it may be, does a lot more history. You find out a lot more about Shiites and Sunnis and Kurds and what the region has been like for the last 100 years, and incidentally about European imperialism.
Right. I know people in the United States, I think Kuwait is an ancient country.
Yeah.
It's the ancient land of Kuwait.
Yeah, let's discuss why there's a border dispute.
Right, right.
I mean, who drew that border? That's things you didn't hear about. You didn't hear that at all. But you sure heard about global positioning systems and how you could be sitting in a sub in the Mediterranean and lofting.
And Europeans heard more about how that border got there, and yet at each turn, and the peace movements were bigger in Europe, or somehow more. The polls showed more of a sentiment for peace in Germany, certainly, and yet every time all those countries sided with us.
Oh, sure. It's knowing, I mean.
It was a little confusing to me. It was, I guess, I saw the Warsaw Pact crumbling, and I thought, well, maybe NATO will sort of, loosen up a little bit, and we'll have some independent.
A lot of folks thought France would be more independent.
I certainly did.
We kept expecting France to bolt, and they never did. Oh, God knows.
What kind of coverage was that on television? What kind of coverage about the NATO alliance and the allies, and what France had to say? What France had to say today?
On NATO, see, you got to understand, UN was a very important part of the story. When we've made stars out of UN reporters, this is true. I mean, it's all on. It was all on there, and the byplay, the French, the British, and in fact, I mean, that's the primary critical voice that we had was the Iraqi representative to the UN. He
was good too. I thought. I always thought he was. I always stopped and watched when he was on.
He was all right, but I mean, it's a way of marginalizing the argument. They only let the official speak for that point of view,
but this goes back to what you were saying before, how the networks were ready to take on the Pentagon for the ground war. I mean, I hope you're not praising the networks for that. I mean,
No, I'm just telling you what happened,
Okay. You mean you don't have an opinion?
That's what they were doing,
Yeah.
It turned out to be wrong. The whole war is over, so you don't need to have opinions on it.
What did you report on in Saudi Arabia before the war started?
Oh, the morale of the troops.
Well, sure, okay. There was some about that.
The morale
and
of
that
the
guy,
troops was in Dunesburg.
The New York Times reporter went out to a small town to report the economic boom in rural towns in Saudi Arabia because of the military presence. And he was arrested by the U.S. military,
and his Saudi press
credentials were yanked, and he was sent back and put in his hotel room and told not to go out again. This was what it was.
To his credit, he disobeyed that too. He was good. He was a New York Times reporter who was good.
To his discredit, as of this taping, which I know is many days in advance of when the show will actually happen, he's missing this morning. So we should.
He's one of those missing. One of the 25 reporters.
There's a lot of reporters missing. Where are they missing, in Basra or something?
Southern Iraq. But let's move on past that subject because that'll be old news by the time.
That's right. Right now, people watching this know what happened to Chris Hedges.
Where did TV fail? And that was a fine question. What should have those reporters?
I think it was the anti-war movement that failed. And TV did exactly what its job was to respond to the things that were happening, and there was only one thing happening, and that was the war.
Yep. Well, let's move on to that then. Where did the anti-war movement blow it?
Oh man, we don't have enough time to talk about where the anti-war movement blew it. I'm mad.
Why?
I really am, because I look back and at what we did to try to stop the war, and clearly, I mean, I shouldn't be mad, but we got caught so flat-footed. This happened so fast, and we were all, it's like every other war, you know, and the pro-war people were on one side and the anti-war people were on the other, and in every war, offensive weapons carry the day early on because they're new and nobody's invented the defensive weapons to act against them. And that's, you know, tanks and then anti-tank guns, planes and then anti-aircraft guns. This time it was the incredible speed at getting this war up and running and over versus, and we didn't have anything to counter that. And we were, you know, when the war ended, we were still planning marches, you know, and trying to get, you know, crowds in front of TV cameras. And
you know,
go ahead.
I think the anti-war movement failed years ago. Failed somewhere in the years between the end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of this war. The anti-war movement failed in appropriations bills. The anti-war movement failed in that we had all these tinker toys to play with, and we had a Pentagon budget to justify.
right.
That's where they failed. They didn't fail because they didn't have 100,000 instead of 25,000 at a march, or I mean that they failed years and years
true
ago.
enough. You go back and they failed not being able to bring I mean, there are many different places where you could have brought some rationality to this process, and it wasn't the anti-war movement that failed to deal with the Palestinian question, but it needed to have been brought stronger, clearly. And I like Dan's point about the speed of the buildup. I think that's crucial, and I think it's an understandable mistake. Things in the United States have always built up incrementally and slowly, and the Pentagon figured out before the anti-war movement figured out that now things were not going to happen incrementally. They were going to happen all at once.
We were praising ourselves, and the alternative press and even the mainstream press was praising the peace movement in like September, October, November for the speed with which it was getting up and running, right? And there, you know, isn't it amazing that we're having big marches before the war even starts, and we were fighting a great Vietnam anti-war. But we got trounced.
Everybody fights the last war.
We were fighting the last war. Unless the war goes on long enough that you can develop defensive weapons.
This will not be another Vietnam. That's not a military announcement. It was a political announcement. This will not be another Vietnam. There will not be another anti-Vietnam war movement.
So that's why I think
that's also where the peace movement failed. By even connecting itself to the Vietnam anti-war movement, because all of a sudden when you connect yourself like that, you're surrounded by baggage.
I disagree. The problem that you were talking about before, about what we should have been doing before, was maintaining the connection to the Vietnam anti-war movement. By the mid-'70s, at the University of California at Santa Cruz, every time a military recruiter would come on campus, there'd be a great peace demonstration and peace tables, and we would be countering the military effort. Mid-1970s, even after the Vietnam War ended. That went along until about 1980. And then
that's what I'm saying, we're Americans.
All that ended.
We're anti-war people, we're Americans. We don't have any more sense of history than any other Americans. You know?
Yeah, if you want a historical sense, Vietnam's that history, and that's what this thing's about. That's what it's about for the people who did the war, and it's what it's about for the people who are opposed to the war. I would just like to throw one thing in here. You know, we are on Missoula television, so let's use the word Missoula a few times. I think that the peace movement in Missoula did some of the things that the peace movement nationally should have done.
Oh, absolutely.
And the marches here were larger in the fall, and the spirit was up and running. There were a lot of organizing going on. They weren't waiting for the air war or the ground war to start. And the second thing that I think that was done right was an imaginative, witty, caring action within the first few hours of the war. And of course that's the basketball piece. And the ESPN was on basketball courts on campuses all over the country. You know, they were at a basketball game on a campus in Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin, for crying out loud. Where that's the part of the failure of the peace movement was not to notice what was going on in Missoula and to follow it. And instead, the peace movement is planning big demonstrations for 3 weeks from that date. Absolutely wrong.
I think think the tactical lesson I would learn, if there was going to be another war sometime soon, and I could remember this one, but I won't because
you're American.
Because I'm an American. But trying to mass armies, to go back to the military metaphor, trying to mass armies against this war, I think was kind of a mistake because it takes time to do that, and we didn't have the time. But the basketball action was guerrilla warfare. If you can get 4 people together to agree on something and you can do it fast, go out and do your action. Do something big and, as Bill says, caring and witty and appropriate and not violent and not hostile, but quick and visible and funny, so it makes the network news, like the basketball action was, and not wait around.
Yes.
And this idea of planning marches 3 weeks in advance, you just get caught flat-footed. And if everybody had been doing this, if at every ESPN game somebody had gone on the basketball court, if these small things had happened again and again, it would have been much more visible, I think.
I don't know that you can even have called the peace movement a failure yet. No, I mean, you can certainly call it a failure.
It lost the first half.
Yeah, they're down a lot of points in the first half. The war started,
and it
escalated, and was won. Okay, and we're still sitting here talking about
We'll get
whether
it
or not
together.
the peace movement.
I don't think it had it.
Talk over him, Tracy.
Yeah, Dan, shut up.
But that's actually fun.
We got our draft counseling center going.
In saying that all right, the first failure was letting the war start, the biggest failure yet. But in 6 weeks, you can't mount an anti-war campaign big enough to stop a war. You just can't do it.
That's why I'm saying don't mount
They
it.
could have.
The failure was before the war
started. Could have been done. Television works for us too, as well as for them.
So.
Yeah.
And if we could have used it, if we wouldn't have been so hostile about it, and if
Define we.
the peace movement, men, right, guys with red ties.
Suits and ties on.
I had power tie. I think the media could have been used. There should have been people around who understood that it had to be used and it had to be used fast. And there were some, but not enough. The problem is in that first few days, the Pentagon had amazing tales of success. I was watching a tape of that first night. Wolf Blitzer announcing that all the Scuds were destroyed on the first night. And the Pentagon was telling these astonishing lies the first night. And in that 2 or 3 day period, Americans came to think, okay, this is going to be easy. We've got this. I know I'm going to pick the winner and be for this war. And at that same time that Wolf Blitzer was there saying we got all the Scuds, the peace movement needed to be out there at the same time, challenging people's conscience and keeping them open.
We're talking about 2 things. We're talking about keeping a peace movement going between wars, and then we're talking about what to do in the moment of crisis. And you folks are saying that guerrilla civil disobedience that gets on television is the new weapon of the anti-war movement.
Didn't need to be civil disobedience, but whatever it took to.
What else gets on television?
Whatever it took. I think whatever it took to get on television.
The peace movements.
And I hate to sound
and as
so
you say,
crass.
the enormous peace movements did not get on television much.
Right.
So what else?
15 people here got more coverage than 150. 15 people on the basketball court here got more networked airtime, and if we're going to use that as a measure of success, a quantifiable measure of success, than 150,000 people.
More honest time, their message was more fully reported, and it was more interesting to watch.
Right. It was brilliant.
Would that have lasted, or part of the shutdown that occurred that didn't allow the peace movements to get on, the peace demonstrations to get on television, was that as the war got going and the hysteria grew, it was very easy to say peace activists are traitors. We don't cover them.
There was. The LA Times did have a story about a TV station in the Los Angeles area that had a policy of not covering anti-war demonstrations and not covering the anti-war movement. A stated policy.
You brought up the San Francisco March, and so I think it was the Chronicle, maybe it was the Examiner, that ran a story.
Don't start with me on
the
Examiner.
They ran a story on the actual march, and they had photos, but somehow they felt compelled to balance it, and so they ran a story about pro-war, quote unquote,
that's
march.
being objective, Trace.
That was 75 people. They gave it the same half-page coverage as the 150,000 people.
Absolutely. So what I'm asking,
So how do you battle that?
Well, that's what I'm asking. I'm saying, you know, but one thing that we've seen that was very effective in getting the message out to the nation was the civil disobedience at a college basketball game. What other measures worked in this anti-war movement?
I mean, that worked because it was.
That's a question. Maybe things were happening,
but if you invited the press there and you said there's going to be this peace demonstration, you would have gotten much less coverage. I mean,
but you got to be witty about it.
Well, that's the element there was.
But the demonstrations were very witty, Bill. There was wit. There was a lot of wit, I think, in the movement throughout.
It's still long.
There was the action at the Missoula. This is what I'm asking you. There was the action at the mall, the Southgate Mall, where people walked around with letters on T-shirts. Whole words, was it?
Whole words.
And that they would form up occasionally into sentences that said, "Stop the war," or "Bring the troops home now." That was very witty. It was.
Why was ESPN filming at the mall? Or I didn't get something here in this story.
ESPN was not filming at the mall.
Of course not. That's why it was dumb to be there.
So it's not a matter of wit. I mean, wit. What I'm telling you is precisely that wit existed at the large demonstrations that didn't get covered. Wit was there at the mall.
But not only wit, but you got to understand the medium. You got to understand the medium.
Exactly.
You know.
And you don't have people in the movement who watch a lot of TV. Forgive me. You know, they don't know.
I study it. I just don't watch it.
They don't know.
Forgot to take the lab. Huh?
That's right. I hate lab courses.
You know, you got to know how to play these people. You got to know when their deadline is. You got to know what their sense of humor is. You got to know what the best time of day.
I'm saying there are two things going on. There is communication within a local community, and that can happen without TV cameras.
Right.
The people who thought of going to the mall, a place not on campus, a place that peace activists don't hang out, and doing a demonstration there to bring the message in a humorous way to people at the mall, that was smart, that was witty, and that was clever, and that was good. And that helped, that helped say something within Missoula. To me, I bet that was going on all over the country. So that's one question, and that ultimately sways people.
But ultimately is the key. And unfortunately, in this war, we didn't have ultimately to play with. We had 37 days, you know.
Well, and really 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
And the thing had to be kept open in the first 2 or 3 days, and it wasn't.
Right.
The other part of the story is that there was some time before the war started, and and public opinion was seriously split, and I think the anti-war movement almost won the pre-war war.
The vote in the Senate was 52 to 48. I mean, that's an astounding split. It wasn't even close to that in Vietnam.
That's
it was
right.
unanimous.
Right.
The opinions of foreign policy elite in Nunn's hearings in December were almost uniformly against the war.
And the polls in the public were split. But as soon as our boys and our women were out there, then the public sentiment switched.
Meg said a really smart thing.
How does the peace movement hold on to that?
You got to keep it open. You got to keep it open when it happens.
Well, there was an awful lot of letter writing going on then, I think, but there weren't. I mean, there's
letters.
I know.
Letters.
That's what I'm saying. I'm agreeing with you, Bill. I'm agreeing with you. We wrote lots of letters.
Such a charming 19th century thing, isn't it?
No, I'm not. I'm acknowledging that letters to congressmen. I mean, we at our church, you know, there were postcards out, and they would, you know, with the address of our congressman, and you could write your opinion on a postcard, and they were encouraging people to do that. I think that happened a lot.
I hope my mother's
No,
not
it didn't make any. It didn't seem to make any difference. So I'm agreeing with you. What could have been done at that point?
Right. I mean, we had it
more
right
of
there.
what happened here.
We're sitting on the balance, you know, and things are swaying. And I had friends after the war broke out who said, "No, I'm not gonna be vocal about this because I feel I can't. I feel that I have to back my country now that it's in a war."
Well, what about this?
How do you change that sentiment?
How about if the drumming that was going on outside the White House, let's say in every town that had enough activists to do it, there was somebody drumming all the time in the town square, okay? Let's just say, for example, somebody had thought of this.
Somebody should be drilling at the military recruiting center. I mean, you know.
I think in the town square, because wherever.
We had drumming in the town square.
But I mean 24 hours
here's
a day.
the Leipzig forms the precedent for us.
Leipzig forms, of course, we have a professor. Leipzig is going to form.
In East Germany, the way the East German government was essentially brought down was that people started having demonstrations in Leipzig and didn't stop. When they didn't have them one Sunday and then say, oh, this was great, we'll have another one in 4 weeks. They had one Sunday and they said, now everybody come back tomorrow. And every day it got bigger and every day it got bigger and every day it got
only
bigger.
got smaller. We had our Zen Buddhists at the is that the World War I statue in front of the courthouse? They lived there for days.
And the federal building at noon every day.
And that was, again, one of the strong things that Missoula did.
And the bridge with the candles at 5 o'clock.
That's part of the reason why attitude about the war was different in Missoula than it was in the rest of the country.
Do you think attitude was different?
Yes.
Oh, definitely.
How so?
Oh, man.
I mean, I felt a really strong pro-war.
Oh, of course there was.
But instead of being 7-1, it was 4-1. Okay, in favor, let's say. I mean, sure, Missoula was overwhelmingly in favor of the war.
I think the Bay Area was that way too in California, and they also had some very attention-grabbing demonstrations early on.
Police cars.
And then they blocked the bridges and made a lot of people angry.
I don't know.
But it was a very visible anti-war movement there.
And I liked your idea, for example. I like this idea of no business as usual. I think could work in a quick way, because if you make life uncomfortable for people, okay, I'm a big fan of civil disobedience, and I'm a big fan of confrontation, because if you make noise that's hard to ignore, like drumming, or if you shut down bridges, or if you shut down streets like you wanted to do, and you just make life uncomfortable, it reminds people all the time that there is a war going on. Because to me what was so terrifying about this war is people, not only the support was one thing, but people didn't even know what was going on.
But Dan,
go out to the
Americans,
Safeway and they'd become, I know.
We don't like to be uncomfortable.
Right, I know.
So we can't shut down a block. We can't shut down a block.
Well, you can't do it through the city council.
We can't do it through the city council.
You can do it by lying down on the street.
And you can't, people did that.
I
did that.
I know.
And Mayor Dan came down to the streets and said, this is civil disobedience.
I know, and he's so earnest. How can you tell the man no? He stands there and he makes this eloquent argument. How can you tell him no?
And he makes eloquent arguments in Harper's, about the values.
He uses more syllables in Harper's.
He uses many syllables in Harper's about the values of community. And I thought, well, why don't we translate those to the street? Why don't we close down a block of a city street in Missoula and have it be a standing memorial? And then if you have drummers come along and they want to drum every day, they've got a standing, quiet memorial that every day somebody passes by and goes, God, I gotta go around the block again.
But obviously yours was the wrong tactic. It was close. The idea of shutting down the street was a good idea, but you were counting on the institutional, legal mechanism to make it happen, and by the time it could have even come up for discussion in the city council, the war was over. And I'm not saying we could have...
I also like that. I like your idea, though, Tracy, partly because it says to people,
for a while.
Because saying that you're going to be a little uncomfortable is reminding people that the people in Iraq and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia are very uncomfortable now.
Without water, without medicine, without,
And what you were talking about, the people who converted after the war started, I have to support my country, my troops. How do we get them to think? It's also important that lives are being lost in other countries, and people of different colors are dying.
Getting back to the media, how do we get them to think that when somebody like Cokie Roberts on NPR, I mean, Cokie, who's not exactly a conservative woman, says the day the ground war has broken out, and they're discussing what's going to happen on the ground war, and she said, well, so far, nothing bad has happened. And I said,
was that your letter back that they read Sunday morning? And that's how you let her. That's how you stop her.
Did you have a letter on it?
There was a great letter from somebody in Missoula back to her Sunday morning that just gave her a heck of a hard time for that. And I'll promise you, she heard about that letter.
Granted, she'd worked too many hours since the war started. She's probably working 80 hours a week, but. So she says something like, nothing bad has happened, and I'm thinking, Cokie, come on, put in a preposition. Tell me 2 Americans, tell me something. Nothing bad has happened.
Prepositions are expensive.
And then people, I'm sure, driving down the road or sitting in their kitchen listening to NPR just went,
Yep, sure.
And I just was horrified. So how do you win over that side who was with the
people? Hey, I've got an idea. Let's put Peter Arnett with a satellite dish in Baghdad while the war happened.
Oh man, come on, don't be ridiculous. You could never do that.
It's the only weapon you have against that. I mean, the Americans are great at
why didn't that make an impact on the polls, Bill?
Why did people think that Peter Arnett
didn't make? I think part of the reason the polls are running so strong, or running at this 85 or 80%, is that people have to deny what they've seen and what they know to be the case. And I think this may be a war with an aftertaste.
Are they going to deny it in 1992?
A war with an aftertaste? You mean people might turn against? I like it too.
I think it might be a war.
A war with an after.
This is not Gulf War Dry, but Gulf War Regular.
A spot now for a war with an aftertaste?
Gulf War Regular.
Well, this war, you could say it tastes great, but it was less filling than any of the other wars.
No, I think there's I mean, my sense of it is that there's a real hysteria among Americans about this war. And part of that hysteria has to be a reference back to Vietnam.
Sure.
But part of that hysteria, I think, has to do with the fact that we saw it. And we saw it the same way that we watch pictures of that plane crash the other day in Colorado Springs. We watched the same kind of pictures, better pictures really, of an American bomb, of the effects of an American bomb on a Baghdad shelter. And I think there's some denial in all this pro-war hysteria.
Is it denial or is it numbness? I mean, when we watch it on TV docudramas, when we watch it on police shows, when we watch it on war shows, when we watch movie after movie after movie about Vietnam, you get numb to it. I mean, when you can have a classroom...
You're younger than I don't get numb about the Vietnam era. It's not numb at all to me.
But see, there's a generation where it is numb.
People
There's a
Tracy's
generation.
age vote.
There's a generation where you go to some people. You know,
That's true.
I must say,
we could check the numbers on that one.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you remember hearing a story about a classroom full of kids? They're sitting there in their 4th grade, and they're sitting in rural America in an elementary school, and a jealous lover comes in and shoots the teacher. Boom, she's dead. Half the class runs away screaming, half the class just sat there and watched it. No reaction.
Hey, that's a story about school.
No, that's
We're talking about war.
That's a story about television.
Those kids wanted to get an A.
That's a story. No,
Right, they knew the rules.
That's a story about television. I mean,
I'm not sure, Tracy. I think it's really complicated. I watched A Bridge Too Far, just as the war was winding down.
It's a movie about World War II.
World War II movie. Okay, all right.
watch movies.
She knows her history.
I'd actually watched that 3 years ago or so, and was fascinated by it, and felt that I learned something about World War II. But watching it in the final days of this war, it was just painful. It was painful to see. My viewing of that movie had been transformed by real current events, and I'm not sure to what extent we're just numbed by that stuff, and to what extent we're numbed by the reality
Well, you know what's
of our
interesting?
daily lives.
That movie, Not Without My Daughter, that Let's Hate People in the Middle East movie that came out with Sally Fields. Remember that?
Didn't see
Right, nobody knows about it because it's about an American woman. It's a true story about an American woman married to an Iranian guy in the States. After 10 years of marriage, they go back to Iran for a visit to his family. This is right around the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1980. He becomes, in this story, a fundamentalist nut, starts beating her up, imprisoning her.
So we're doing reviews of movies we never saw.
And she comes up.
Yes,
Wait,
yeah, right. That sounds good to me. I like your explanation of it, but I can't dance to it. I'll give it a second.
And we saw the trailer just as the war was about to start, and it looked like a movie written by a computer to make us hate fanatical Middle Eastern people who don't shave, okay? And I thought, whoa, that movie is so well timed, it's going to be a big hit. It sank like a stone. Meg, you should forgive the expression, Meg...
Thank you.
That's right. Can you swim?
Meg's point might be right. People might have gone to see that, and though they aren't saying they're upset about the war, maybe they are and couldn't handle this movie. And it might be interesting to see.
I think you guys are giving Americans much too much credit.
I don't think you're giving them enough credit. And
I think you're giving them just enough credit.
That's right. That's right. It's a little bear. In order to do politics, I think in order to organize anybody, you're going to have to give them the benefit of the doubt and try and show them how to. I mean, if you let the Pentagon, grab them heart and soul, then you're going to have to show these folks how to get out of that trap. And I think there's good analytical ways to talk about the sources of this hysteria. And
you think there'll be a backlash?
Did that on
you think in a few months? you think in a few months there'll be a backlash. This aftertaste will manifest itself.
I think the network, the talk now on the networks, the critical talk is coded as the diplomatic question. And any time anybody mentions the Palestinian question on the networks, those are my guys talking about the aftertaste of the war. And they are responding directly to people who say, "Oh wow, let's get a parade together so we can cover a parade with lots of yellow ribbons." Those are the guys who want to tell that part of the story. There's a code going on.
Don't be euphoric. I mean, he knows.
George obviously had some serious sessions in the White House with Baker over what the heck they were going to do now, and it was impossible for him to be euphoric.
How did TV translate that statement? Don't be euphoric. I mean, was there commentary on it? Was there news analysis on it? That's a big statement.
Oh, they've been doing that all along. I mean, they're warning. You know, we've whooped all the Scuds, but don't be euphoric. Iraq is a big, strong nation, and if we can whoop them, we'll really be good. Don't be euphoric. Watch out. There's going to be a little recession, but we can whoop it. You know, it's psychological management. Bush, Oliphant, the cartoonist, took away Bush's purse.
Did you see that today?
And says, he may get it back. Well, let's look at how he deals with the recession and.
When the recession, Neil Bush, education, drugs, chickens come home to roost. It's an old crisis. Chickens come home.
And I've even heard that. I mean, Saul Landau the other night was talking about how it sounded like even within the cabinet, I mean, there have been deep splits over the war all along, and Bush has aligned himself with Cheney and Powell, and from the very beginning, that was the triumvirate that we saw. And there are plenty of disgruntled people in Washington who've been pushed aside. So the split may also be occurring.
Of course, by the time this is
inside the Beltway,
we'll know more.
It's true.
Because things are going to move, if things move as fast as they've been moving.
So the people who are watching this and can sort of talk back and say, well, those guys up there. No wonder they got that bug that says not CNN.
Ordinary people.
That's right. It is the beauty of cable community access television.
That's right. Well, there'll probably be another war between now and then. Nobody's going to know which war we're talking about.
The people on CNN are just ordinary folks, too.
I mean, you're calling Charles Jacob just ordinary folks?
Yes, I am.
You're calling Wolf Blitzer?
I'm calling Wolf just an ordinary guy who had a bum beat until the war broke out, and then all of a sudden Wolf
he still had a bum beat. Can you imagine?
I think he's been replaced. Holloman's on the Pentagon beat now. Maybe Wolf had a vacation.
Maybe Wolf finally had a night off.
Right, gave him a night off.
Pregnancy leave.
Did Jaco get a rest? Because right after Jaco's, you didn't see this, and you didn't even. None of you saw it actually, but Meg saw it. One night, you know who Jaco is? Can you picture Jaco?
I can't.
Charles Jaco, C.S. Jaco. He has a little mustache. He was in Iran.
He did CNN stuff for.
Oh, right, the Bush jacket under the palm tree. Got it.
Yeah, well, this describes all of them. Yeah, right. That's as opposed to that other guy in the Bush jacket in the palm tree.
Schwarzkopf. Anyway, one night he's talking, and it's about 8 or 9 nights into the war, and he obviously hasn't gotten any sleep, and he looks terrible. And a Patriot has gone off, and he's on camera with his replacement. Obviously, CNN has sent out some fresh troops. And this guy's standing next to Charles Jaco, and Jaco's standing, looking very haggard and talking, and he gets a whiff of the propellant that has shot the Patriot up in the air, and he freaks out. He says, "Gas!" And he drops the microphone that makes this kaboom when it hits the floor. And he's struggling into his gas mask, and he's just totally freaking out. He's like testing the filters because somebody had suffocated the night before in Israel, from putting on the gas mask.
Disappearing from the camera, kind of bobbing up and down like a jack in the box.
Meanwhile, the other guy, the guy who's had a good night's sleep in the last 48, is just standing there looking at him. And
here's the interesting thing. Jaco recently told New York Magazine, everybody was doing that. Everybody around me was diving for their gas mask, so I thought I had to. We've got footage that shows this replacement standing very calmly.
Right.
Looking around.
Right.
So, they're ordinary people in that's actually part of what made TV so much fun this time, is because you'd see people like that. The first
Bernie Shaw was under a table.
Bernie Shaw was under a table on Scud night. Lisa Scherzer and the fat American in Jerusalem. I think they pulled him out because he was really wetting his pants. His voice was shaking, and he was saying,
"Can you say that on cable television?"
I've got my atropine right here. He was all ready to stab himself with his atropine, and that's part of what made it so much fun to watch, because these people were in a war. And
seeing a reporter, I mean, report on scene from inside of a gas mask. I mean, you know,
that is astounding.
That's an extraordinary thing, you know.
It was good. It was good.
Good television.
And gas masks sold out. You know, you can't buy a gas mask in the United States anymore. Every dog and his mammy. We wanted to do this show in gas masks. Couldn't get gas masks because they're all sold out. All these old Dutch NATO war surplus gas masks that sell for $39 in the Army Navy stores are gone.
So that makes great TV. It makes great video because you see journalists, you know, sitting there in gas masks. I mean,
as Ira says, everybody looked like Heckle and Jekyll talking to each other. You know,
what would the world have done if they'd seen Walter Cronkite, you know, reporting in a gas mask? I mean, so yeah, it makes great video. But what were they telling us?
They were telling us
I'm not sure the message of that either. I mean, I'm not sure how wonderful that or how vulnerable that necessarily made us feel. It certainly brought home the urgency of the war and the fact that the war was happening without bodies, without the results of the bombs. It was theater.
The basic message was, you know, we're over here. You know, the story's happening right now, and we're over here. And the basic code to that message is, and Peter Arnett is in Baghdad. You know, and I think it took us a good 20, 30 years to get over the idea of the Vietnam War, that was a war genuinely stopped by internal opposition, by domestic opposition, by the fact that the war policy itself was morally corrupt. It took 20 or 30 years to get over. It's not surprising that this one will take 20 or 30 months to get over the fact that now all wars happen with a correspondent in Baghdad.
Well, clearly the lesson Americans have learned that the worst thing that happened in Vietnam, the true horror of the whole Vietnam War, was that some people were disrespectful to the troops that came home. That was the crime of Vietnam. Now, the Christmas bombing this is another way to go back to where the peace movement blew it. I think all the support the troops stuff was a big mistake.
That's what I meant by carrying Vietnam's baggage.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That was baggage that the peace movement did not need.
The Christmas bombing in My Lai never happened. The big crime of Vietnam.
But I was around during Vietnam, and I didn't carry guilt and baggage about that. I mean, the Vietnam vets were leaders of the peace movement. They were heroes. They were the people who ripped off their badges and threw them over
nobody remembers that.
The White House fence. Everybody who was there at the peace movement then remembers that.
But those people aren't on television, which gets us back to Bill's point. You know, exactly. There are plenty of people who had that experience in Vietnam, but they weren't on television. They weren't being interviewed. They weren't in the paper. They were muzzled. They were silenced. And I think
if the peace movement would have done it right, they'd have been as it happened in Missoula. Over and over again, Missoula did this thing right. They foregrounded Vietnam vets. I think it was Greg Burnham gave just an extraordinary speech at the rally on campus. And over again, Missoula did that, and over again, the peace movement nationally didn't. I think there were ways to do this. We needed to understand the conservatives and the Republicans understood that they were fighting over the legacy of Vietnam, and we were trying to pretend that Vietnam wasn't important. That we wanted to talk about Baghdad. Wrong. We needed to be talking about Vietnam.
I think just to throw sort of a wrench into this. I think the peace movement,
as is your want.
I think the peace movement went wrong in Missoula by overtly saying everyone who's in the peace movement does support the troops. I heard some people say, I don't support the troops. Yeah. They made a moral decision that I can't abide by. Yeah. I'm not going to spit in their face, but I don't support them. You know, and I heard people saying that, and I heard people saying, and I'm not going to sign on to a platform that says that. I'm not going to sign on to a platform.
There was a
they
real
didn't say it publicly, because
dichotomy in people's feelings.
I mean, speech.
You know, there really was a long period in which recruitment was done without protest by peace activists, and with advertisements that said, learn a skill, learn a trade.
Be all you can be.
Be all you can be. We didn't talk about killing. There was a victimization. There were a lot of people who wanted to get their families out of a ghetto to a nicer town, earn bigger salaries, and really didn't weigh in the cost of war.
We're in one of those civilian trades that are necessary, like how to work a flamethrower.
Hey guys, my quarrel is not with the troops. I think the experience in Missoula was widespread. I know several people who served over there, who still are over there, and former students former associates, and doggone it, the issue is not with the troops.
I think that's
don't have any argument with them. I'll support the troops. The argument I have is with George Bush. It's a policy question, and I talked to wives of people who of men who were over there, and I think I was able to explain that point and get that point across.
I think that's where the peace movement went wrong. They put too much stock in the backstepping and tracing over past mistakes and saying we support the troops when they should have been saying we don't support the government policy.
Right.
By the way,
exactly.
we do support those people's humanity.
Exactly.
But it was we support the troops first instead of this policy is just
and
inane.
let's also note that the only coverage of morale on the front lines was done in Doonesbury. I mean, people weren't people out there weren't talking much disagreement among troops about whether they should be fighting this war.
The only inkling we had that morale with the troops was anything other than just rah-rah was in Doonesbury. You're right. That too was forbidden speech. Did it happen at meetings that you were at, anti-war meetings, and I seem to see it a lot, that meetings and even at some of the rallies, people would just be kind of working up some good, useful anger and some good, useful energy to organize against the war or to express against the war, and then it would all kind of, somebody would say, but we got to support the troops, and we're not criticizing them. Everybody kind of mumble, yes, we support the troops, and it seemed like again and again the energy would get diverted and get diluted.
I think
because we had to always say, but we support the troops. We hate this system. We hate capitalism. We hate.
Oh my God! We support somebody controlling.
No, really. I mean, you want it to be angry at so many things, but you always have to say.
I think the peace movement, in all fairness to them, and much different than Vietnam, they were starting before the war started, and I think that the peace movement was on such a roller coaster because the war's only 6 weeks. So you're forced on that roller coaster because it's the beginning. So I think.
But we had that great build-up.
Yeah, but it was a build-up of a roller coaster ride.
I agree.
And that was the problem.
When we're talking about the media, we also have one more element of the campaign here to discuss, and that is our own Missoula billboard. Let's talk a little bit about the peace sign on the dish as we close.
Okay.
As of this recording, the peace sign has been painted over again. It's now white. There is no peace sign. That happened in the final days of the war.
Tragic. I feel as though my culture has been deprived. It's sort of like taking I don't know. Anything, any comparison I would make would be culturally disrespectful, but it's.
When I first moved to Missoula, I lived in an apartment on the north side, and I woke up every morning and looked out my window and saw that peace sign, and I thought, Missoula really is a different town,
what a hip
and
town.
I really like it, and I think basically it's just inane. I mean, this has been going on for years, this painting the peace sign, covering the peace sign, painting the peace sign, covering the peace sign. I heard somebody joking the other day saying, well, they're probably going to take away from the technical ability with so many coats of paint. I mean, it's just over and over and over and over and over.
U.S. West told me I asked them, has the peace sign ever interfered with a telephone signal? And they say, yes. And I say, when? And they say, when it's being painted on. And I say, and is there also interference when it's being painted over? Yes.
Well, let's
so the only
painting.
time, the only time there's actual interferences.
In all fairness, though, I would be horrified if somebody went up there and painted a big yellow ribbon.
Oh,
I would not.
Wouldn't bother me in the least because I know by the next morning it would be a peace sign.
That's right. The peace sign would finally get up. I'm amazed it's been 7 days since it was painted
No
up.
charge for that billboard.
Right.
Just a symbol of our freedom of expression.
Ooh.
There you go.
Ooh.
Well, that's a heavy note. Anybody got a joke?
Not one I can tell on network television.
Community access television.
Well, this is going. This is broadcast all the way up the Rattlesnake.
Well, the peace billboard could very well be an old moot point by the time this airs.
That's true.
I mean, I have faith in the north side.
Depends on the weather. It depends on the weather.
Yeah, it's got to
apparently.
be warm.
You got to have it warm to paint it on. I hear.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping somebody does that.
The idea I had, there's the yellow ribbons, and as we're taping, we've just had a big Cat Grizz game here last weekend, and I thought that if we would go around and put blue ribbons next to the yellow ribbons, so it'd be the colors of MSU, that would probably get the yellow ribbons down once and for all.
Good idea.
That'd be kind of Abby Hoffman, sort of yippy, sort of, or polka dots, purple polka dots. What does that mean? People would walk around town, what does that mean?
Right. I mean, turn patriotism back into sports enthusiasm.
Sure.
Since before it was feeding from sports enthusiasm into patriotism, now we're going to sort of feed it back into sports.
Right.
The easy transition for Americans back into the usual.
The war has been it's been a spectator sport. I mean, what we've had is an extraordinary spectacle.
The Pentagon used football metaphors. They apologized. Excuse me for using a football metaphor, but really, it was like making an end run. What?
Yeah, right.
Most of the time, they didn't even apologize.
Yeah.
Well, it's just about time to close. Any parting shots?
Fourth quarter score?
Oh, we should do some of those predictions like they do on, what's the show where they do the McLaughlin, where they do a 10-second
Who's
prediction?
a winner and loser?
Right, winner and loser.
Winner Colin Powell, vice presidential nomination.
Okay.
Whoa. Winner Turner Broadcasting. The stock will go up sooner or later.
Yeah. I say winner, ultimately Jim Parker. I think Jim really did an extraordinary job. He got on people's nerves from time to time, and people are thinking about that now. But ultimately, Jim Parker is going to be remembered as a real hero this year.
Loser, me.
Oh my! Yeah, it's been that.
It's been a bad birthday.
Meg's birthday. Well, great.
So long from Missoula Theater of Operations.